I only needed shelter, but that silent instrument had been waiting for my hands.
She was 21 and alone. No home, no family, no money. Just a rusted tin box and $4 she had counted twice from her childhood piggy bank after searching the drawer beneath her bed. And with that $4, she bought a forgotten Gourd instrument studio in Beaufort County, South Carolina, a place that fell off maps in 1979. The roof sagged above the workroom floor. The cedar door frame was split and the windows would not close. Beaufort County condemned it in March 1982, with demolition planned for the following winter season. Inside waited a hidden architectural compartment, sealed for decades inside the resonance chamber of a giant Gourd banjo, holding a secret that would change Vera's life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Vera Whitmore had been listening for forgotten voices her whole life without knowing it. She grew up in a narrow rental house outside Savannah, where the floorboards spoke at night and the kitchen window rattled whenever summer storms came across the marsh. She learned early that old things were not always useless. A chipped bowl could still hold water. A torn quilt could still carry warmth. Her hands were always busy repairing what others had already decided to throw away. Her father left before she could remember his face clearly. Her mother worked long hours cleaning offices near the river, returning home with a tired posture and the smell of lemon soap on her sleeves. Vera never asked for much. She learned to read the silence between footsteps and to keep small treasures hidden in places nobody searched. The person who changed the direction of her life was not family by blood. It was her mother's older cousin, Elias Mercer, a quiet craftsman who lived near the edge of the Sea Islands and spent his weekends making Gourd banjos in a wooden shed behind his house. Every Saturday morning, Vera rode her old bicycle along the dirt road to Elias's workshop. He wore the same faded canvas apron every week, patched at the pocket where he kept small carving knives. The room smelled of beeswax, dried gourds, cedar shavings, and the faint sweetness of tobacco leaves hanging from the rafters. Elias showed her how a gourd was chosen carefully, not by size alone, but by the way it answered when tapped. He taught her that the craft began long before a tool touched the surface. A large gourd needed almost a year of patient drying before it could become the body of an instrument. The inside had to be cleaned without weakening the shell. Goat hide needed to be stretched while still damp, then secured with small brass tacks until the skin tightened like a drum. The neck had to sit straight. The strings had to carry the right tension. Vera copied every measurement into a notebook. Elias never rushed her. He would correct the angle of her knife or move her fingers slightly and let her try again. One afternoon, when she asked why he saved broken instruments instead of buying new wood, Elias placed a cracked Gourd banjo on the table and said, "The quiet things remember longer than we do." She kept that sentence because she understood what he meant. The instrument was not valuable because it looked perfect. It mattered because someone had spent years giving it a voice. When Elias died, the workshop disappeared almost overnight. His relatives sold the property, cleared the shed, and packed away what they believed was ordinary clutter. Vera arrived too late. The notebooks, unfinished banjos, and old hand tools she had used every weekend were already gone. She kept only the memory of the room and the sound of Elias testing a string before sunrise. Years later, that memory was the only steady thing left. Her older brother Daniel had always known how to make people believe him. He spoke softly, dressed neatly, and promised solutions before problems were fully explained. When money became tight, he began making private deals that Vera did not understand. He borrowed against family documents, moved between lenders, and hid conversations behind closed doors. The last time Vera saw him before everything collapsed, he was standing at the kitchen counter holding a folder of papers. "Everything will be handled soon," he told her. The papers were not what he claimed. Daniel had used her identification documents to guarantee debts connected to illegal lenders, then disappeared before the consequences arrived. Vera was left answering questions she could not answer and opening doors she wished she had never touched. The eviction came 6 days later. Rain hit the apartment window hard enough to blur the streetlights. Vera sat on the floor packing the few things she owned when the landlord opened the door without waiting for permission. His hand shook slightly around a folded notice. Behind him, the hallway smelled of wet coats and old carpet. "You cannot stay here after tonight," he said. Vera looked at her mother, who stood near the doorway holding her purse. She waited for her to say something. Anything. Her mother lowered her eyes. The landlord placed the notice on the table. The only object Vera carried outside was Elias's small notebook wrapped in a kitchen towel. "Please, I need one more night," Vera said. The landlord looked away. "Pack your things and leave now." 8 words exactly. The rain followed her into the street. For the next 6 weeks, Vera moved through Georgia and South Carolina carrying one backpack. She slept beneath the awning of a closed bookstore in Savannah, on a bench near a bus station in Brunswick, and for 3 nights on the floor of a church shelter in Charleston. Her money disappeared slowly, then quickly. The first week she had $17, the third week she had $9. By the final days she counted coins before buying a cup of coffee. She avoided shelters when they were full and learned which public buildings stayed warm after sunset. In Charleston she spent afternoons in the public library because nobody questioned someone sitting quietly with a notebook. She read old craft journals, local history books, and anything that mentioned the Sea Islands. One rainy afternoon, while searching through a stack of donated newspapers, she found a small classified advertisement folded inside a local bulletin. OLD Gourd Instrument Workshop, Beaufort County. Structure condemned. Contents included. Land transfer, $4. She read it 3 times. The address meant nothing to her at first. Then she saw the county name and remembered Elias talking about old workshops hidden along the coastal roads. Places where hands had continued traditions even after the world moved on. The next morning, Vera bought a bus ticket with her remaining money and folded the advertisement into the same towel that held Elias's notebook. She did not know what waited at the end of the road. She only knew she had one last place to go. The bus left Savannah before sunrise. Vera sat beside the window with her backpack pressed against her knees, watching the highway change from crowded streets to stretches of pine forest and tidal marsh. The heater above her seat clicked every few minutes, releasing air that smelled faintly of dust. She counted the miles written on the small paper map she had borrowed from the library. The final bus stop was still 11 miles from the property. She walked the rest. Her shoes were thin at the soles, and the February wind came across the open fields without anything to slow it. The first night she slept in an abandoned hay barn outside a farming road near Yamasee. The temperature dropped to 34 degrees, and she covered herself with a canvas tarp she found beside the barn wall. Mice moved through the straw below her, and the roof creaked whenever the wind changed direction. She did not sleep much, but she stayed warm enough. By afternoon the next day, she reached the small coastal town listed on the deed records. It was not the kind of place travellers stopped to photograph. It was a working town with old roads, low buildings, and people who knew which doors still opened before they knew why someone was knocking. Main Street had 5 businesses facing the same narrow road: Mercer Hardware with its faded green awning, Lottie's Cafe with handwritten soup specials in the window, the Palmetto feed store beside a stack of empty wooden crates, Harper's General Goods with 2 rocking chairs outside, and the Sea Island repair shop where bicycles and fishing equipment hung from hooks along the wall. Vera stood across the street for several minutes before walking toward the county clerk's office. The building was made of pale brick and had a brass handle polished by decades of hands. Inside, the air smelled of paper, floor wax, and old wood. A ceiling fan turned slowly above a row of filing cabinets. Nobody looked surprised to see her. The woman behind the counter looked up from a stack of documents. She had silver hair pinned tightly at the back of her head and wore a navy cardigan with one missing button near the sleeve. A small nameplate rested on the desk. Margaret Ellis, County Clerk. "You're here about the Mercer property?" she asked. Vera nodded. Margaret studied the folded advertisement in Vera's hand, then looked at the file beside her. "You understand this building has no active utilities?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the county has marked it unsafe and will not provide repairs?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the transfer price does not mean the structure has value?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand that if the property fails inspection, you may lose permission to occupy it?" "Yes, ma'am." Margaret waited. Vera kept her hands on the counter. "Yes, ma'am." The clerk removed a set of papers from the file cabinet. The deed was thinner than Vera expected. It had been waiting for someone who might never arrive. Margaret placed the document beneath a brass stamp and pressed down firmly. The sound echoed through the office. "Take County Road 18 South until you reach the old walnut trees," she said. "Turn onto Mercer Lane. The property is at the end where the road narrows. You will see a stone well before the house." Vera signed her name slowly. When she handed the pen back, Margaret did not immediately take it. "Whitmore," she said quietly. Vera looked up. The clerk touched the surname on the deed. "Are you related to Elias Mercer?" The question stayed between them. "He was my teacher," Vera said. Margaret removed her glasses and looked toward the window. "Elias used to bring his instruments here when I was young. He repaired one for my father, a Gourd banjo with a cedar neck. He said every instrument carried a piece of the person who made it." Vera felt the notebook inside her backpack shift against her shoulder. "You knew him." Everyone who cared about old things knew Elias. Margaret returned the deed. "He kept saying the workshop was waiting for the right hands." Vera folded the papers carefully. The walk to Mercer Lane took nearly an hour. The road narrowed between fields of winter grass and patches of dark soil. A woman standing beside a mailbox watched Vera pass. She had a wool coat pulled tightly around her shoulders and a brown dog sitting beside her. "That road does not get many visitors," the woman called. Vera stopped. "I bought the workshop." The woman looked toward the distant tree line. "Then you are the first person who has said that in a long time." The dog stood, sniffed the air, then returned to the woman's side. The property appeared beyond a line of walnut trees. The house and workshop sat together as one long wooden structure, approximately 40 feet wide and 28 feet deep. The exterior boards were weathered cedar, silver from years of sun and rain. The roof sagged slightly along the back side. A stone chimney leaned several inches away from the wall. Above the door hung a wooden sign with faded lettering. "Mercer Gourd Instruments." The letters were almost gone. Vera unlocked the door. The first thing she noticed was the smell. Dry wood, beeswax, old smoke. The faint mineral scent of dust that had settled without disturbance. The second thing was the sound. Nothing. No pipes. No electricity. No footsteps above her. Only the slow movement of air through gaps in the walls. The front room held a workbench covered by a cloth that had turned grey with age. Along the back wall hung several dried gourds, some larger than her shoulders. Their surfaces were cracked but intact, each one shaped by years of growing before it ever became an instrument. Her hand touched one. The shell was cool. Behind the front room was the old workshop. The floorboards dipped where heavy tools had rested for decades. A broken chair sat near the window. A shelf held empty jars, a rusted plane, and a small piece of cedar wrapped in cloth. Vera opened every cabinet carefully. Nothing moved except dust. She spent her first night on the floor beside the workbench. She used her backpack as a pillow and placed Elias's notebook beneath her hand. Rain began after midnight, tapping against the roof in uneven rhythms. She listened. The building did not feel abandoned. It felt like something that had been left unfinished. A forgotten room can still hold a song. The first 3 days were measured in small repairs. Vera learned the property by walking through it slowly. The well behind the workshop still held water, though she boiled every bucket before drinking. The outhouse leaned slightly toward the marsh, but remained usable after she replaced the broken latch. At night, she listened to the floorboards and marked their sounds in Elias's notebook. The board near the front door creaked twice before settling. The plank beside the workbench gave one long groan when the temperature dropped. She began learning the house the way Elias had taught her to learn an instrument, by listening first. On the 4th morning, she walked into town for supplies and stopped at Mercer Hardware. The owner stood behind the counter wearing a brown wool vest with a pencil tucked above his ear. His left hand was missing the tip of one finger, and he used that hand carefully when sorting screws into small wooden drawers. The store smelled of cedar boards, machine oil, and coffee that had been sitting too long beside the register. Nothing was arranged for appearance. Everything had a place because someone needed it there. The owner looked at the address written on Vera's paper. "You are the one who bought Elias's place." "Yes, sir." He studied her. Most people buy old buildings because they want them to become new. Vera looked toward the shelves of tools. "I want it to become itself again." The man nodded once. His name was Thomas Reed. When Vera placed her small collection of supplies on the counter, she counted her coins before speaking. "I cannot pay for everything today." Thomas pushed the items back toward her. "Then open a credit account." Vera looked confused. "I do not have a job. You have a building and a reason. That is not the same thing." "No," Thomas said. "But it is where most work begins." He reached beneath the counter and handed her a thin booklet. It was an old home repair manual with handwritten notes in the margins. "My father used this." "Take it." "I cannot take this. You can return it when the house no longer needs you." Inside the booklet were practical notes about roofs, masonry, floors, and old windows. The pages were soft from years of use. Thomas helped her write down the first supplies. Roofing felt, $22. Wood screws, $8. Lime mortar, $14. Chimney brush, $11. Lantern oil, $7. He refused to charge for the nails. "Those are just waiting for somewhere to go," he said. The chimney became her first serious task. The old brick stack had collected decades of creosote. Vera spent 2 afternoons scraping the inside using a wire brush attached to a long extension rod. The first layer came away black and sticky. The second came away as brittle flakes. She wore a cloth mask and worked until her shoulders ached. The chimney took 14 hours over 3 days. She found cracked mortar joints where rain had entered. The old firebox had survived, but only because previous hands had built it carefully. She cleaned every surface before placing a small test fire inside. The first flame burned weakly. Smoke curled downward. She extinguished it immediately. The next morning, she checked the draft again. She adjusted the damper, cleaned the remaining creosote, and tried once more. This time, the smoke rose. The fire pulled cleanly upward. Vera stood beside it for several minutes without moving. That evening, she cooked beans in a small iron pot above the flame. It was the first hot meal she had prepared inside the workshop. The bowl was plain. It tasted like staying. A week later, she began examining the old workroom. She did not search like someone looking for treasure. She searched like someone trying to understand a language. On the shelves she found a set of worn carving knives with handles shaped by repeated use, a bundle of dried goat hide folded beneath a canvas sheet, 3 unfinished gourd bodies hanging from hooks, a small brass tack hammer with a smooth wooden grip, a measuring stick marked with Elias's handwriting, a box of gut strings that had turned brittle with age. Each object belonged to a process. Each had waited. Near the back wall stood the largest gourd Vera had ever seen. It was nearly the size of a small barrel and hung from 2 iron hooks. Unlike the others, it made almost no sound when tapped. That bothered her. A dried gourd should answer. She lowered it carefully onto the bench. The first test was simple. She tapped the shell with her fingernail. Nothing. She turned it. The bottom felt heavier. She weighed it against the others. The difference was small, but real. Vera ran her fingers along the surface and found a circle beneath several layers of old wax. It was not visible unless the light struck at an angle. She cleaned the area carefully. A thin cedar disc appeared. The edge was sealed. She remembered Elias saying that a craftsman should never force something simply because curiosity was louder than patience. So she waited until morning. The next day, she removed the cedar disc slowly. Inside was not empty space. There were packages. The first contained tools wrapped in linen. A small carving knife with a bone handle, brass tacks. A polished scraper. A hand-shaped wooden gauge. The second contained raw materials. Dried gut strings. A piece of dark cedar. Several small blocks of walnut. The third was a tin box. Vera opened it with both hands. Inside were folded papers, a small notebook, and several rolls of old currency. She counted the money 3 times. $25,200. The bills were worn but carefully preserved. Beneath them were coins wrapped separately in cloth. 3 silver mercury dimes dated from the 1930s. 2 Indian head pennies from the early 1900s. A 1,944 steel penny. And 1 worn silver $half from 1917. At the bottom of the box was a military medal. It was from 1945. The metal had darkened, but the engraving remained readable. Vera placed everything back exactly as she found it. The discovery was too large to understand all at once. The letter in the box remained folded. She did not open it. That night, she carried the notebook outside and sat beside the marsh. The water moved slowly beneath the moonlight. Far away, a bird called once, then disappeared into the darkness. She watched the tide rise. She listened to the silence around the workshop. A hollow thing is not always empty. Sometimes it is waiting for the right hands to make it answer. The morning after she found the tin box, Vera carried the letter to the front room and waited until the sunlight reached the workbench. She knew the handwriting before she opened the first fold. It was Elias's writing. Not from the old measurements in the notebook, not from the labels on his tools, but from the way certain letters leaned slightly forward as if they were trying to reach the next word. The paper had yellowed at the edges, and the original creases were still visible from the hands that had folded it many years before. Vera sat down. She unfolded it carefully. My dear one, whoever you are, if this letter has reached your hands, then the workshop has found someone patient enough to listen before changing what they see. My name is Elias Mercer. I'm writing this after my doctor, Samuel Whitaker of Charleston, confirmed that I have Parkinson's disease with progressing nerve damage. I was examined at his small clinic on King Street in Charleston in 1984, and he told me my hands would eventually become less reliable. He was right. I have spent my life building instruments that require steady hands, and now I must accept that hands are borrowed things. My family began this work long before I was born. My great-grandfather Josiah Mercer learned Gourd instrument making near Beaufort in 1871 after his father, Thomas Mercer, who had been born in 1839 near St. Helena Island, carried the craft forward from older traditions. Thomas learned from his father, Elias Mercer, born in 1810 in the Sea Islands, who preserved methods passed through generations before written records were kept. Elijah's father, Samuel Mercer, born in 1778 near Charleston, was the first in our family to record the measurements, rhythms, and songs connected to these instruments. The trade closed on September 18th, 1985. I did not tell many people. More than 30 years of silence followed because I believed the work would disappear if I handed it to someone who only wanted the appearance of an old craft. My wife, Clara, died before she could see the workshop continue. My brother Andrew was lost during the Korean War in 1952, and his absence taught our family that some empty spaces cannot be repaired. They can only be honored. If you choose to work here, remember these things. Dry the gourd slowly. Keep the drying room between 70 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit for the final weeks before cutting. When preparing hide, soak the goat skin for at least 12 hours. Then stretch it evenly while it is still flexible. Mix lime mortar carefully. Use 3 parts washed sand to 1 part hydrated lime and allow each repair to rest before adding weight. For cedar soundboards, allow the wood to settle for a minimum of 6 months after shaping. Rushing the material creates a voice that will not last. A craft is not inherited through ownership. It is inherited through care. The person who holds these tools after me does not own what came before. They are only responsible for carrying it farther. If you have arrived here after hardship, do not mistake your broken pieces for useless ones. The cracks tell you where the light has entered, and the empty spaces tell you where sound can begin. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Elias Robert Mercer, October 4th, 1985. Vera read the letter once without stopping. Then she read it again. The second time, she noticed the places where the ink had grown lighter, where Elias's hand had slowed. When she finished, she folded the pages along the original creases and returned them to the tin box. She did not place them beneath the money. She placed them above it. The letter belonged where it could be reached. The back door of the workshop opened with difficulty. Vera pushed it until the old wood gave way, then stepped outside carrying the small cedar box from the workbench. The letter had mentioned a marker. She followed the path behind the workshop where the grass grew thinner near the walnut trees. Beneath one tree, half covered by fallen leaves, she found a flat stone with a simple carved name. Elias Mercer. There were no dates, only the name. Vera brushed away the leaves with her sleeve and sat beside the marker until the afternoon shadows moved across the ground. That evening, she returned inside and opened one of the old heirloom objects from the cache. It was Elias's carving knife. She cleaned the blade with oil, wrapped the handle with fresh cloth, and placed it beside the lantern. The knife did not look new. It looked cared for. That difference mattered. Over the following days, Vera began noticing the small kindnesses that had carried her farther than money ever could. Margaret Ellis at the clerk's office had stayed late so Vera could complete the deed transfer. Thomas Reed at the hardware store had opened a credit account when she had nothing to offer but determination. The woman by Mercer Lane had left a basket of apples beside the road without saying who brought it. The old church volunteer in Charleston had quietly saved Vera a place near the heater during the coldest night of her homelessness. There are moments when a person survives because someone else chooses to make a small space for them. If you're listening to this story, think about one small kindness someone once gave you when you needed it most. Who was that person? And what did they do that stayed with you? That night, Vera slept beside the workbench with the heirloom tools wrapped in linen near her bedroll. The workshop remained quiet around her. But for the first time, the silence felt different. It was no longer the sound of something abandoned. It was the sound of something being remembered. The first snow arrived on December 6th. 3 inches covered the walnut branches and turned the path to the well into a narrow strip of mud and ice. Vera sat at the workbench that morning with Thomas Reed's repair manual open in front of her and read the roofing chapter 3 times before touching a single tool. The roof measured roughly 1,120 square feet. Her calculations showed she needed 32 bundles of shingles, 12 rolls of felt paper, and nearly 6 pounds of roofing nails. She wrote every number down because guessing had no place on an old roof. Thomas found her standing outside with a notebook in her hand. "You need a better hat," he said. The next morning, he brought her one. It was a weathered roofing hatchet that had belonged to his uncle, a man who had repaired barns along the coast for 40 years. The wooden handle had been worn smooth where another hand had gripped it thousands of times. "I cannot take this," Vera said. Thomas placed it on the porch. He would rather see it working. The roof became an 11-day task. Vera was joined by Harold Voss, a retired roofer who lived 3 roads away and walked with a slight bend in his back. He refused payment before she even offered. "I have enough money," he said. "I need enough purpose." He showed her how to check a sister rafter before replacing damaged boards, how to snap a chalk line without wasting movement, and how to drive a nail in 3 clean strokes instead of fighting the wood. On the 7th morning, Vera held a crooked shingle in place. Harold looked at it. "That nail's proud." She frowned at the raised head. "What do I do?" "Pull it." 2 words. She removed it and started again. By mid-December, the final row was secured. The roofline was not perfect, but it was straight, sealed, and strong enough to carry another season. When the last nail went in, Vera sat beneath the repaired roof and listened. The house sounded quieter. Not empty, settled. The chimney work began after Christmas. The bricks had suffered years of rain and temperature changes. Some surfaces flaked away in her hands, leaving small piles of red powder on the ground. The mortar between sections had weakened until it could be brushed away with a wooden tool. Vera rebuilt it slowly with a mixture of hydraulic lime and fire clay, using a careful ratio that Thomas confirmed from his father's notes. 3 parts lime mortar to 1 part fire clay for the damaged heat areas. The work lasted 3 weeks. Most mornings stayed in the 20s Fahrenheit. Every 15 minutes. Vera stepped away from the wall and warmed her hands because her fingers had become too numb to hold the trowel properly. She repaired 1 section at a time. No shortcuts. No hidden cracks. In late January, she built a small test fire in the restored fireplace. She watched the flame carefully and checked the room for any sign of smoke returning. The chimney drew clean. The fire burned upward. For the first time in years, warmth moved through the old house the way it had been designed to. The floors took longer because they required patience more than strength. The original boards were white pine, cut from trees that had grown before the workshop existed. Some planks still carried the marks of hand-cut rosehead nails beneath layers of dirt and old finish. Vera rented a random orbit sander from Thomas's store for $14 per day. She followed the process exactly. The first pass used 80 grit paper to remove the damaged surface. The second used 120 grit to smooth the grain. The final pass used 220 grit until the boards felt almost soft beneath her fingertips. She applied 3 coats of oil finish, waiting between each layer and allowing a full 48-hour cure before placing furniture back inside. The wood changed slowly. Years of darkness gave way to a colour somewhere between deep honey and mahogany. Not new. Restored, There was one morning when Vera could not work. The weather was clear, but she stood outside near the marsh watching a great blue heron move through the shallow water. It remained still for nearly an hour, waiting for the exact moment to move. She understood the lesson without needing to explain it. She returned home that afternoon without lifting a tool. The windows were the last major winter repair. There were 8 in total. 3 had no glass left. 4 held cracked panes that moved inside their frames. One original pane from 1788 remained intact, thin and uneven, with tiny waves trapped inside the glass. Vera preserved that one. She repaired the others carefully using DAP 33 glazing putty, warming small amounts between her fingers before pressing it into the wooden frames. She learned to smooth the edge with the putty knife at a consistent angle, removing excess without damaging the old wood. The replacement windows received 1/4-inch cotton sash cord. She tied each counterweight using a figure-8 knot, checking the movement several times before closing the frame. The final window took the longest. The frame had warped slightly, and Vera spent an entire afternoon adjusting it until it moved without resistance. When she finally stepped back, a chickadee landed on the walnut branch outside. The bird stayed only a few seconds. Vera stood quietly until it flew away. Then she closed the window. The plaster work began near the end of February after the coldest nights had passed. Behind the walls, Vera found hand-split oak lath still holding beneath layers of damaged material. The original horsehair plaster had survived in places, but 3 patches near the chimney had failed completely where years of moisture had entered. She removed the loose sections carefully. Thomas Reed brought her an old paper bag from the back of his hardware store. "My father kept this," he said. Horsehair from when people still repaired things instead of replacing them. Vera mixed the lime plaster slowly, adding the horsehair until the mixture held together without becoming heavy. The first coat was the scored scratch coat, pressed firmly into the lath. The second was the brown coat, about 3/8 of an inch thick, which required a 72-hour cure before the surface could be touched again. The final finish coat was only 1/8 of an inch. She worked it smooth with patience. When the last section dried, Vera placed her palm against the wall. "These patches will hold another 100 years," she said it quietly. The house did not need promises, only careful hands. Spring brought people to the workshop in small ways. Doris from Lottie's Cafe was the first. She was easy to recognize by the silver streak running through her dark hair and the old metal watch she wore above her wrist. Every Thursday morning, Vera found 2 paper bags on the doorstep. Bread, soup, fresh fruit. When Vera brought money to the cafe, Doris pushed it back across the counter. "Save it for when the shop reopens," she said. "I want payment in candles when the shop reopens." Vera smiled because she understood the request was not about candles. It was about being included. A week later, a teenage boy arrived riding a faded blue Schwinn bicycle. A splitting maul was strapped across the back rack. His name was Caleb. He had paint on his hands and a habit of looking at the ground before speaking. "I heard you needed wood split," he said. Vera offered him money. He shook his head. "My mother said, about your grandfather." He would not explain further. He simply picked up the maul and began working. The third person was Reverend Boyd. He walked past the workshop every morning wearing a brown coat with one missing button and carrying a small leather book under his arm. He never entered without being invited. He only tipped his hat. One morning, he stopped at the gate. "May peace remain here." 4 words. Then he continued down the road. The workshop changed because of these small arrivals. Not quickly. Not loudly, but enough. Vera waited until February 11th before opening the cellar entrance. She had avoided it because the rest of the house demanded attention first. The cellar measured 12 by 15 feet, with a fieldstone floor and 7 granite steps descending beneath the workshop. The walls were built from stones placed by hands that had known the weight of every piece. At the centre was a dressed granite slab. A craft mark was carved into the surface. Vera traced it with her fingers. She did not lift it. Some things deserved to remain closed until the right question arrived. While checking the third step, she noticed a small gap beneath the granite edge. Behind it sat an oak box wedged tightly into the space. Inside was a brass key. The bow of the key was shaped like the same symbol used in the old Gourd instrument designs. Beneath it was a tintype photograph. The image was dated 1903. A young woman stood outside the cottage holding a woodworking tool. Her clothing was simple. Her posture was familiar. Vera stared longer than she expected. The woman looked like her. On the back of the photograph was an inscription. Clara Mercer, daughter of Josiah Mercer, age 25, summer of 1903. Vera turned the photograph over again. She checked the date. She checked the face. The resemblance remained. She placed the key on the mantel above the fireplace. She did not search for what it opened. Not yet. By March, the last snow disappeared. The creek behind the workshop grew louder, carrying water through the low fields. Walnut trees opened with small green catkins, and birds returned to the branches above the repaired roof. Vera considered beginning the full Gourd banjo work. She had the tools. She had the notes. She had the space. But she decided against rushing. That spring, she would use only 1 coin from the cash for materials and practice on smaller samples first. She would learn the feel of the wood again. She would let her hands become familiar before asking them to carry something older than herself. The workshop had waited many years. It could wait a little longer. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Vera finished her first complete heritage craft instrument. She did not call it a reproduction. She called it the first. The gourd had dried for months before she shaped it. The goat hide had been stretched carefully across the opening and secured with brass tacks placed one by one. The cedar neck came from the old supply hidden in Elias's cache. She used gut strings, adjusting the tension slowly until the sound settled. The first note was not loud. It did not need to be. It moved through the workshop and returned from the wooden walls with a warmth that felt older than the room itself. The restored interior remained simple. The original workbench stayed beneath the window. The 1788 glass pane remained untouched. Elias's tools rested in a wooden drawer lined with cloth. The floors carried their deep honey-brown colour, and the fireplace held the same quiet strength it had gained during the first winter. The house had not become something new. It had become whole. The brass key remained on the mantel until one cold afternoon, when Vera noticed something unusual about the oldest walnut tree. A small brass plate had appeared beneath the bark where a natural opening had formed over decades of growth. She recognized the symbol immediately. Her hands were careful as she inserted the key. It turned. Inside the hollow space was a folded 48-star American flag and a small envelope. The note inside was written by Clara Mercer's mother, dated during the First World War. It explained that the flag had belonged to a family member who served overseas during the conflict, and that it should remain with the land until someone understood why it had been kept. The words were not about victory or pride. They were about remembering the people who left and the people who waited. The military medal from the tin box belonged to Andrew Mercer, the family member lost during the Korean War. Vera brought it to the Beaufort National Cemetery on July 27, 2025, The anniversary of the Korean armistice. She placed the medal beside flowers and stood there without speaking for several minutes. Some names needed no speech. The money from the cash remained almost untouched. Vera spent only 5 coins from the collection on necessary materials during the restoration. The rest was sealed inside a new wooden box beside the original tools. A note on the box read, "For the next one." The workshop reopened quietly. There was no announcement. No celebration. Doris placed an index card on the cafe corkboard. Gourd Instrument Workshop. Lessons by appointment. Within months. More than 40 names had been written on the small mailing list. Most came from nearby towns. Some came from people who simply wanted to learn how something forgotten could become useful again. One afternoon, Caleb returned carrying a hand-carved wooden sign. He was older now, but he still arrived with the same careful posture and the same habit of looking at the ground before speaking. The sign read, "Mercer Gourd Instruments, Daughters." Vera ran her fingers over the carved letters. "You made this," Caleb nodded. "I thought the old sign needed company." She placed it beside the original one. The 2 signs hung together. Neither replaced the other. Years after finding Elias's letter, Vera began writing one of her own. She used the same opening words. "My dear one, whoever you are." She wrote about the workshop. She wrote about the people who had helped. She wrote about the tools that passed from one hand to another without belonging completely to anyone. She wrote because she understood something Elias had known. A hollow thing is not always empty. Sometimes it is waiting for the right hands to make it answer. The letter remained unfinished on the workbench beside a carved piece of cedar. Outside, the walnut trees moved with the evening wind. The Gourd instruments hung quietly from the walls. The house waited. The craft waited. The future waited. A forgotten place can still hold a voice when someone chooses to listen. Gourd Instrument Studio waits. It has always waited. The dollar bill Vera used during the deed transfer never left Margaret Ellis's desk drawer. Years later, the county clerk still kept it beneath the old paperwork, folded neatly beside the brass stamp that had transferred the property to the young woman who arrived with almost nothing. She kept it there because some things are not valuable because they can be spent. Some things are valuable because they prove someone came.